Hi everybody, I'm Ryan. Today we're going to talk about Amulet Titan. We're going to talk about the card choices in the deck, how the deck works, some interesting play patterns of the deck, because this is one of the more difficult decks to play in Modern, but if you play it right, it is so powerful. Consider this a basic-ish overview that will get you started in understanding the deck and the basic play patterns, and if people are interested in this, maybe I'll do a deep dive a little bit later on. Let's jump into it. This is Amulet Titan. Now what this deck is attempting to do is put this card Amulet of Vigor on the battlefield, which is a 1-mana artifact that says whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped under your control, untap it. On the surface, it doesn't actually seem that powerful. However, when you combine that with these enter the battlefield tapped, return another land to your hand, but tap for 2 mana lands, it can create a pretty insane surplus of mana during the turn you play it, especially when combined with Dryad of Elysian Grove, Azusa, and grabbing lands with Primeval Titan, and a Boreal Grazer for that matter. So the absolute basic play patterns of this deck are to play an early Amulet of Vigor, play a Boreal Grazer, Dryad of Elysian Grove, and or Azusa, sometimes Summoner's Pacting into those cards. Use the multiple land drops plus the untaps from Amulet of Vigor to play a very early either Primeval Titan or Cultivator Colossus. Again, we can Summoner's Pact for that as well. Very often with Primeval Titan, you're going to be grabbing Slayer's Stronghold and Boros Garrison to give Primeval Titan haste so you can attack in the same turn to grab 2 more lands, normally a bounce land and Teleria West to put Teleria West in your hand so you can search out another Summoner's Pact to play another Primeval Titan, etc. It is totally nuts. But that's the basic level 1 of the deck. But there's a lot more going on than that. There were a few cards in the main deck that I didn't mention. And there's a lot of lands that we play here that are utility lands. First off, the One Ring is a more recent addition to the deck. What this card does is with the protection, it lets you buy time so you can set up your combo a little bit easier, and lets you draw cards so you can set up your combo a little bit easier. It is exactly what this deck needed and is so powerful. An Expedition map is played to fetch out with Urza Saga, which we'll talk about in just a moment, so that we can grab lands to cast Primeval Titan if we happen to be lacking those. And so let's go through our utility lands, and I'm actually going to reorganize really quick. So our lands come in a few different categories. The most basic category are the basic lands. It's important to play these because things like Boseiju exists and whatever, and people are going to be trying to snipe our lands that produce multiple mana, as well as our Urza Sagas, so being able to grab those basics is pretty important. Also, Blood Moon exists, and so having the basics in our deck is doubly important. This next category are pseudo-utility. Vesuva can enter the battlefield as a copy of any land on the battlefield, which is very powerful if you are unable to search out a land that you really need to enter the battlefield and become untapped. Normally this is Boros Garrison, frankly. So that you have access to that colored mana, but you had already fetched it out. So you can have it enter the battlefield as that land so that you can use the mana that you need. There are other utility things for that is really corner case. Often it might enter as a Valakut for as an additional Valakut or whatever. But Vesuva having access to it is super powerful. Also, Cavern of Souls, which if we're fetching it out, it's normally with a Expedition map so that we can cast Primeval Titan without it being countered, is also pretty powerful. Now these cards, Boseiju, Otawara, and Teleria West, all have channel or transmute abilities where they do something from our hand, right? Boseiju is able to destroy a artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land opponent controls. They grab a basic land. They grab a basic land type card. Otawara returns a permanent to their hand. And Teleria West lets you transmute for mana value 0, which means you can grab Summoner's Pact with it. That's like the primary reason we transmute. Sometimes we can grab Engineer Explosives, to be fair. And the reason these are kind of toolbox cards is, yes, we can naturally draw them and play them. However, we can fetch them out with Primeval Titan, grab it and a bounce land, and then purposefully bounce this land back to our hand so that we can use it as the utility that it means to be. And so there are more steps to it, but we can still use this as like a toolbox our deck in this situation. More often than not, what you're going to be doing is going to be bouncing Teleria West so that you can keep pumping out Titans so you can grab that Summoner's Pact and whatever. But in either case, it is very powerful. Lands that make it all happen are these bounce lands, are the produce 2 mana bounce lands. Again, you can like returning lands to your hand so that you can reset them, like these cards are very powerful. And the idea that they become untapped if you have an Amulet of Vigor on the battlefield, or multiple untaps with the Amulet of Vigor on the battlefield, is also really strong. Understand multiple Amulet of Vigors are multiple triggers, which means if I have 2 Amulet of Vigors on the battlefield and a Selesnya Sanctuary enters the battlefield, it is going to untap. I can then tap it for mana, and then the second Amulet of Vigor trigger is going to resolve. It's going to untap, and I can tap it for mana, so it can produce 4 mana. What's also relevant is you get to decide on the order of the triggers as they resolve. So if you grab, let's say, 2 mana-producing lands, they enter the battlefield at the same time, or even maybe more realistically, one of these lands in like a Teleria OS, they both enter the battlefield tapped, but you can decide to let the Amulet of Vigor triggers resolve first, so you get your untaps, so you can get the Teleria OS mana before the trigger of the Selesnya Sanctuary or whatever bounce land actually resolves as well. And there's a lot of weird nuancy things regarding that. So what makes this deck so consistent? And it's these cards. Urza's Saga gives us an additional way to win the game, which allows us to create a construct artifact or whatever in its second chapter, but we're really playing it for its third chapter, where we can search our library for an artifact card with mana value 0 or 1, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. Amulet of Vigor is cost 1. And so if we play Urza's Saga on turn 1, by the third turn, we have an Amulet of Vigor on the battlefield. If we combine that with Mycosynth Gardens, or a naturally played amulet to be fair, where we can pay X and it becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. So we pay 1 mana, have Mycosynth Gardens copy the Amulet of Vigor, and now we can start going off with these Primeval Titans, with these bounce lands, and producing a ridiculous amount of mana. Once you have multiple amulets, the game feels over as long as you can resolve a Primeval Titan. Now, once you resolve that Primeval Titan, what makes these Primeval Titans even more powerful is the ability to give it haste with Slayer's Stronghold. So like I mentioned before, Primeval Titan, grab Boros Garrison, Slayer's Stronghold, give the Primeval Titan haste, attack, search out more lands, and do more ridiculous shenanigans that I mentioned before. And then Slayer's Stronghold allows you to give it double strike. Primeval Titan and Cultivator Colossus both have trample, and so giving them double strike through trample, the double strike will still happen even if they're chump blocked, and it's just a ridiculous amount of damage every time. And then an alternate win condition is Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. You notice that we have 0 mountains in our deck. However, Dryad of Elysian Grove makes lands every basic land type in addition to their other types, which means we can trigger the mountain trigger on Valakut super easily if we have a Dryad of Elysian Grove. And if we have a Dryad on the battlefield and we play Primeval Titan, we can do stuff like crazy nutso stuff, like grabbing 2 Valakuts to get 1,000,000 triggers or whatever. My Primeval Titan haste, get a bunch more triggers and stuff. And it is just like another awesome way to win, especially through cards like Ensnaring Bridge and stuff like that. But that is the absolute basics of the main deck. Again, there's much more nuance to this deck that I mentioned. That would be more of a deep dive situation, not like a surface level deck tech situation like we're doing. I'm already going way more in depth than I do in my other deck techs because this deck is just so complex. Well, let's look at the sideboard and talk about why we're playing these cards in our sideboard. Dismember is just easy removal. It's pretty important in a mostly green deck. Tear Asunder is good artifact and enchantment hate, but the extra mana is no big deal, so really it's just kind of a removal spell as well. Spelunking is a new card that I really like bringing in against decks that had a lot of answers to our Urza Saga or Amulet of Vigor or Blood Moon decks where we kind of have to side out our Urza Saga. Just to have more Amulet of Vigor effects is pretty important. Endurance is decent graveyard hate. Force of Vigor is additional artifact and enchantment hate, also particularly good against Blood Moon because we don't need to like have mana to cast it. Generous Ent is another Blood Moon hate card, being able to grab our forest so we can still cast our spells. Bajuk is graveyard hate. Cavern of Souls is counterspell hate. Emrakul, the Promise End, we play against decks that we're looking to grind with. And then Engineered Explosives is just really strong against decks like Rhinos and Hammer Time and stuff like that. That can sometimes be a little bit faster than us. There you have your deck tech on Amulet Titan. I realize I didn't go into the super duper nitty gritty of this deck, but this deck's hyper complex and I'd love to do a deep dive if you guys are interested. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social media. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.